The morning Morris walked into my office and sat down in my chair. I was already in the parking lot. I watched him through the window of my car. He didn't look around first. He didn't hesitate. He just walked in, pulled out the chair I had sat in for 31 years, and sat down like it had always been his. I had my coffee in one hand and my phone in the other. On my phone was a signed agreement I had finalized the evening before. I had been working on it for 4 months. Morris had been working on his plan for 3 years. I want to tell you how that Monday morning ended. But first I need to tell you who Morris was, and who I was, and how a man can watch something being taken from him for 3 years and still be the one who walks away with everything. My name is Gerald Harwood. I am 68 years old. For 31 years I ran a structural engineering consulting firm out of Hamilton, Ontario. I built it from nothing. In the beginning it was a desk, a telephone, and a drafting table in a rented office above a dry cleaning shop on King Street. By the time my wife Margaret got sick, it had 42 employees, 3 satellite offices, and contracts with the city of Hamilton, 2 regional municipalities, and a provincial infrastructure program that kept us busy for the better part of a decade. I am not a complicated man. I went to work. I came home. I coached my daughter Leah's soccer team until she was 14 and told me, politely but firmly, that she no longer needed me on the sideline. I was at every recital and every graduation. I drove Margaret to her treatments every Tuesday and Thursday for 22 months without missing a single appointment. Margaret passed 2 years ago. She was 64. We had been married for 39 years, and I will not pretend that her passing did not change me, because it did. It changed the shape of the days. It changed the silence of the house on Glenview. It changed the way I understood time, which is to say, I began to understand that time was not something I had an unlimited supply of. Leah was our only child. She had her mother's instincts and her mother's patience, and I had always been proud of her in the particular way a father is proud when a child turns out to be a genuinely good person. She had worked at Harwood Engineering in an administrative capacity since her mid-20s. She knew the firm well. She cared about it the way you care about something you grew up inside of. Morris came into our lives 8 years ago. He was a commercial real estate developer out of Toronto, polished in the way people who are raised to be polished are polished. With the firm handshake and the eye contact and the ease in rooms full of important people that Leah never quite had and always quietly admired. He was 41 when they married. A year later, he joined Harwood Engineering as Director of Business Development, a title I created for him because Leah asked me to and because in those early years he was genuinely useful. He had relationships with municipal procurement officers. He brought in 2 contracts in the first year. He understood the language of proposals and tenders in a way that my senior engineers, who were brilliant at their work, did not. I gave him latitude. I gave him access. I introduced him to every person in my network who mattered, and I did it without keeping score because he was my daughter's husband and I believed in giving people the full benefit of what you have to offer. I want to be fair to Morris. For the first 2 years, he earned what I gave him. Then Margaret got sick. It was small enough that I almost missed it. About 18 months into Margaret's illness, one of my longest-standing clients, a project manager at the city named Raymond Voss, stopped returning my calls directly. He had been returning my calls directly for 11 years. We had worked on 6 major infrastructure assessments together. I had been to his daughter's wedding. He had come to our firm's 30th anniversary dinner and given a toast. I mentioned it to Leah. She said Raymond was probably just busy with the new budget cycle. I said probably. But I noticed. 3 months later, I was at a regional procurement event, the kind of event I had attended every year for 2 decades, shaking the same hands, having the same conversations. I found myself talking to a developer named Paul Chen who had used Harwood on 2 commercial projects. He was pleasant, and then he said something that lodged in me the way a splinter lodges, small and invisible and impossible to ignore. He said, "I wasn't sure you'd be here, Gerald. Morris mentioned you'd been stepping back a bit." I said, "Did he?" Paul said, Well, with everything going on at home, completely understandable. I smiled. I said it had been a difficult year. I moved on to the next conversation. But on the drive home, I turned the word over in my mind. Stepping back. I had not used those words. I had not told anyone I was stepping back. I was managing my wife's illness while running a 42-person firm, which is not stepping back. That is running harder than you have ever run in your life, with less sleep than you have ever had and more to lose than you can afford to think about. I did not confront Morris. I had enough to carry. I told myself it was possible Paul had misunderstood something, that Morris had been trying to contextualize my reduced visibility at events, that I was reading too much into a passing comment from a man I saw once a year. I told myself these things. I almost believed them. Margaret passed in March. Morris gave a eulogy at the service. It was well written and he said exactly the right things. Leah held my hand through most of it. I was grateful that day for the family around me. In the months that followed, Morris took on more. He presented at client meetings I would normally have led. He began signing off on proposals. He represented Harwood at 3 events I would have attended before Margaret's illness. I told myself this was practical. The firm needed continuity. I had trusted him for years, but then something happened that I could not explain away. It was a Thursday in September. I came into the office earlier than usual, around 7 in the morning, because I had not been sleeping well and had found it easier to simply get up and go somewhere purposeful. The office was empty except for our office manager, Sandra, who had been with Harwood for 16 years and was not a woman who embellished or dramatized. When I walked past her desk, she looked at me with the particular expression of a person who is deciding something. I stopped. I said, "Sandra, is there something you want to tell me?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Gerald, I probably shouldn't say this." And then she said it anyway. Because Sandra was fundamentally decent and had worked for me long enough to know the difference between what was appropriate and what was necessary. She told me that at a staff meeting the previous Friday, while I had been at a project site in Brantford, Morris had told the assembled team that the firm was going to need to evolve its leadership structure in the coming year, that the industry was changing rapidly, that Harwood needed someone who could move at the speed of the current market. He had not said my name. He did not need to. I thanked Sandra. I went to my office. I closed the door. I sat at my desk for a long time looking out at the parking lot below. There was a particular and very clear moment that morning when I understood that what was happening was not accidental, not a misunderstanding. Not Morris being clumsy or ambitious in the way young men in good positions sometimes are. This was a campaign. It was methodical and patient, and it had been running for at least 2 years. I had been watching it unfold without naming it. I named it that morning, and then I did something that a different kind of man might not have done. I did not go to Morris's office. I did not call Leah. I did not send an email or schedule a meeting or raise my voice to anyone. I picked up the phone and I called my lawyer. The quiet preparation. His name was Douglas Firth. He had handled Harwood's corporate work for 20 years before retiring to sailing and consulting and the particular satisfaction of a man who had worked enough. He was 67 and sharp in the way that people who have spent decades in corporate law remain sharp long after the business cards are gone. He met me for lunch at a restaurant near the harbor on a Tuesday and listened to everything I had to say without interrupting once. When I finished, he said, "Gerald, what does the ownership structure of Harwood look like right now?" I told him. The firm was structured as a corporation of which I held 70% of the shares. Leah held 15. Morris held 15, which I had granted him 3 years ago at Leah's request as a gesture of confidence in his role. Douglas was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the water. Then he said, "And the key assets, the municipal contracts, the provincial agreement, the registered engineering seal, where do those sit?" I said they sat in the operating company. He said, "Then that is where we begin." What followed over the next 4 months I will describe carefully because the details matter, and I want you to understand that what I did was not impulsive. It was not emotional. It was the most methodical thing I had ever done in 31 years of running a business, which is saying something. Douglas introduced me to a corporate restructuring specialist named Carol Jennings, who had spent 3 decades working on exactly this kind of situation and who was the most unsentimental person I had ever met, which was precisely what I needed. Together, the three of us built a new structure, a holding company, which I incorporated under the name Harwood Group and which I owned entirely and alone. Into this holding company we transferred, through a series of legal assignments that Carol managed with careful documentation, 3 things. First, the master service agreement with the Provincial Infrastructure Program, which represented 43% of Harwood Engineering's annual revenue. Second, the registered professional engineering seal under which all of our significant municipal and provincial work was approved and stamped, which was attached to me personally as the firm's principal engineer. Third, the intellectual property around 2 proprietary structural assessment methodologies we had developed internally over 15 years, which every major client in our portfolio had specified by name in their contracts with us. The operating company in which Morris held his 15% stake remained intact. Every employee still worked there. Every day-to-day function ran normally. Nothing visible changed. But the foundation had shifted, and Morris did not know. There was one more thing I needed to do. I reached out directly to Raymond Voss, not through the firm, not through any channel Morris might be aware of. I called Raymond on his personal cell number, which I had had for 11 years, on a Saturday morning, and I asked if he would meet me for coffee. He came. Over that coffee I learned what Morris had been telling him for the better part of 2 years. Morris had been suggesting, quietly and consistently, that Gerald was struggling, that the grief had taken more out of him than anyone around him understood, that the firm would need new leadership within the next 18 months, and that Raymond should be building his working relationship with Morris directly so that when the transition happened, there would be no disruption to their partnership. Raymond looked at me across the table and said, "Gerald, I want you to know I never fully believed it, but I wasn't certain what to think." I said, "I understand completely." He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to let him finish." Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly in the way of a man who has understood something he did not need explained. I flew to Toronto on a Wednesday and sat across from the procurement director of the Provincial Infrastructure Program, a man named Frank DeLuca, and I told him that Harwood Engineering was undergoing a structural reorganization and that the master service agreement would be novated to a new holding entity called Harwood Group, that all engineering work under the agreement would continue to be stamped by me as principal engineer, that nothing substantive was changing except the corporate vehicle holding the contract. Frank had no objections. He reviewed the documentation Carol had prepared and signed the novation within 2 weeks. I drove home from that meeting and sat in the kitchen on Glenview and poured myself a glass of the scotch Margaret had bought for my 65th birthday and never quite opened, because there was always a reason to save it for later. And I thought about how strange and how complete it felt to have finally stopped letting things happen to me. I said nothing to Morris. I said nothing to Leah. I smiled at family dinners. I answered emails. I reviewed proposals. I came in on Tuesday mornings and attended the standing project meeting and listened to Morris speak with the particular confidence of a man who believes he is 3 moves from winning. I let him believe it. A man who believes he is winning stops watching for the move that ends the game. In November, Morris called a board meeting. He came prepared in a way he had never been prepared before. He had a full presentation, printed materials, slides, a proposed new management structure in which Morris would assume the title of managing director with full operational authority, and Gerald would transition into a founder emeritus role, advisory only. No client-facing responsibilities, no operational authority, present for continuity, sidelined in practice. He spoke for 40 minutes. I let him finish every word. When he was done, I said, "Morris, this is very thorough work." He said, I've been thinking about this for a long time, Gerald. The firm needs this transition. The industry is changing and we need leadership that can move with it. I nodded. I said, I have one question before we discuss it further. He said, Of course. I said, Who currently holds the master service agreement with the Provincial Infrastructure Program? A pause. Small. Barely a second. But I had been watching him for 3 years and I knew his face. Harwood Engineering holds it, he said. I said, Which specific Harwood entity, Morris? He looked at me, the look of a man doing rapid calculations. The corporation, he said. I slid a document across the table. You should have a look at the current corporate registry, I said. The master service agreement was novated to Harwood Group 8 weeks ago. Harwood Group is a holding company I incorporated in August. It is wholly owned by me. Leah looked at the document. She looked at me. I held her gaze because I needed her to understand in that moment that what I was doing I had done carefully and that I would explain everything. Morris picked up the document. He read the first page. He read the second page. He set it down with the particular care of someone who is managing what their hands are doing because the rest of them is not yet under control. I said, The operating company is intact. Your 15% stake is intact. Leah's 15% is intact. But the provincial contract, which is 43% of our annual revenue, now sits in an entity you have no ownership interest in. The registered engineering seal sits there as well, which means any work requiring a principal engineer's stamp goes through me regardless of what title anyone in this room holds. Morris said nothing for a long time. Then he said, Gerald, I think we should talk about this separately. I said, I'm happy to talk, but I'd like Leah present for all of it. He looked at Leah. She was still reading the document. The board meeting was a Wednesday. The Monday after was when I pulled into the parking lot at 7:30, turned off the engine, and watched Morris walk into my office and sit in my chair. He did not know I was outside. He did not know what had happened over the previous 4 days. On the Thursday after the board meeting, I had signed a new consulting agreement with Raymond Voss's department at the City of Hamilton. The agreement was between the city and Harwood Group. The value was $2.3 million over 3 years. Raymond had been ready to sign for 6 weeks. He had simply been waiting for me to ask. I finished my coffee. I got out of the car. I said good morning to Sandra, walked down the hall, and pushed open the door to my office. Morris looked up. He was sitting in my chair with papers in front of him and a pen in his hand and the particular posture of a man who has been rehearsing something. I said good morning. I sat in one of the chairs across from my own desk. I did not ask him to move. I looked at him directly and without any particular expression, and I waited. He said, Gerald, I've been thinking about how we move forward from Wednesday. I said, so have I. He said, I think we got off on the wrong foot. I think my presentation spooked you, and that wasn't my intention. I said, it didn't spook me, Morris. He said, I'm trying to build something here. I'm trying to take this firm somewhere it couldn't go without someone who can move the way the market moves now. You built something incredible. No one is disputing that. I said, I know. He said, but Gerald, you're not going to be here forever. I said, that's true. A pause. I let it hold for a moment. Then I said, there's a contract on the desk in front of you, underneath the pages you brought. He looked down. He moved his papers. He picked up the Harwood Group agreement with the City of Hamilton. I watched him read. At approximately the 30th second, his face changed. He said, you signed this Thursday. I said, yes. He said, this is Raymond Voss. You went directly to Raymond. I said, Raymond and I have worked together for 11 years. I called him. He put the contract down carefully. He looked at me. And then he said, I never said you were finished, Gerald. I said, Paul Chen told me what you said at the procurement dinner 2 years ago. Raymond told me what you told him in this office. Sandra told me what you said at the staff meeting in September. I paused. You did this carefully and you did it patiently, and I understand the strategy. But you built it on a foundation that was mine. And when the foundation moves, everything built on it moves too. Morris looked at the contract. He looked at me. He did not speak. I said, I'm not asking you to leave. You're good at what you do, and you are Leah's husband, and those two facts matter to me more than you may realize right now. But the terms are going to change. We're going to document everything properly, with counsel present, with Leah in the room, and there is going to be a clear and permanent understanding of who owns what and who decides what. I stood up. I said, My chair, Morris. He stood up slowly. He moved around the desk. I sat down. I opened my laptop. I had a 9 o'clock call. He stood there for a moment longer. Then he walked out. What followed was slower and less dramatic than the morning I just described. These things always are. Morris agreed to a renegotiated role. Director of Business Development, with clearly written boundaries. No authority over client relationships that predated his arrival at the firm. No signatory rights on agreements above a defined threshold without my written approval. His 15% ownership remained. Leah's 15% remained. But the governance documents that Douglas drafted and Carol reviewed now specified, in exact language, what each party could and could not do without the consent of the others. It was not a comfortable period. There were months when the air between Morris and me in that building was careful and thin. There were evenings when Leah called and I could hear the weight in her voice, the difficulty of loving both sides of something that had fractured. I did not enjoy those calls. I took them because she needed to have them, and because I had learned from 31 years of running a business and 39 years of marriage that the conversations you avoid are always more expensive than the ones you have. I told Leah once, on one of those evenings, that I had not done any of this to punish Morris. I told her that was the truth. I had done it because a man who builds something for 3 decades and then allows it to be quietly dismantled while he is grieving is a man who did not understand what he built. And I had understood what I built, every brick of it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Dad, did you know the whole time? I said, Not the whole time, but long enough. She said, Why didn't you say something sooner? I said, Because I needed to be ready first. She was quiet again. Then she said, Mom would have known what to say about all of this. I said, She would have said I took too long. Leah laughed. It was the first time I had heard her laugh in what felt like months. It was the best sound I had heard since the previous spring. I am 68 years old. I have buried a wife and outlasted a grief I did not believe I could outlast. I have run a firm for 31 years and sat across from more than a few people who had decided, for their own reasons and on their own timelines, that I was finished. None of them were right, but some came close, and the ones who came closest were never the loudest ones. They were the ones who were patient and methodical and quiet, and who understood that a man in the middle of losing someone he loves is a man who may not notice what is being moved around him until it is too late. What I want to say to you, if you are a person who has built something, a business, a family, a reputation, a life, and you have begun to feel it shifting under you in ways you cannot quite name, is this. Your instincts are not paranoia. Your instincts are not sentimentality. When something feels wrong in a structure you know better than anyone alive, that feeling is information. Treat it as information. Write it down. Date it. And before you say a single word to the person you suspect, get quiet. Pay attention. Do your homework. The loudest thing I did through all of this was silence. 4 months of it. I smiled at family dinners. I took the calls. I let Morris believe he was 3 moves from the end of the game, because a man who believes he is winning stops watching the board. When you have spent 30 years building something, you know where every weight sits. You know which pieces hold everything else up. You know which relationships are yours and which were built on borrowed trust. And if someone is planning to use that knowledge against you, you have an advantage they cannot replicate. Use it, but use it correctly. Use it quietly. Use it only after you have been thorough enough that when the moment comes, there is nothing left for the other side to say. Harwood Group is doing well. The provincial contract renewed last spring. Raymond Voss retired in June and introduced me personally to his successor, a woman named Dana Park, who called me the following week and said Raymond had told her we had worked together for over a decade and that she should consider the relationship one of the firm's most valuable. That phone call meant more to me than any contract value could capture. Morris brought in a significant municipal infrastructure agreement last fall, and I acknowledged it at the board meeting because credit belongs where it is earned, and I am not a man who holds permanent grudges. He is good at what he does. He made a mistake in how he pursued what he wanted. He has not made it again. Leah had dinner with me last Sunday. She brought a bottle of wine Margaret would have chosen. We sat in the kitchen on Glenview for 3 hours and talked about ordinary things. Before she left, she stood in the doorway and looked at me the way her mother used to look when she thought I wasn't paying attention. She said, "You're okay, aren't you, Dad?" I said I was. I meant it. If there is someone in your life, someone close to you, someone you trusted and gave access to and introduced to every room that mattered, and that person has decided that your age or your grief or your quietness means that you are finished, I want you to hear this as clearly as I can say it. Being underestimated is not a disadvantage. For a patient man, it is the most useful thing in the world. Let them make their presentations. Let them sit in your chair. Let them believe what they need to believe to keep moving forward with their plan. And then make your move. Tell me in the comments below, has someone ever underestimated you and lived to regret it? I would like to hear from you.